So here's why I think saying, what about the men, is a valid argument. And when feminists say, oh, MRAs just say, what about the men, that's a completely invalid criticism. Take a look at this headline. In India, boy victims of sex crimes don't get talked about. Now, the background on this, in India, males, men and boys, are actually not protected by sexual assault under law. The way the laws are written specifically exclude men and boys. And it's because directly of feminists. And if you think that's an extreme or misinformed claim from some crazy right-wing sites, I did a video on that very topic. So go ahead and click in the description below. That is how it is. But let's go to the article. Mumbai. He was lured into a room near where he played cricket. A man then shut the door and window and raped him. That's what a 14-year-old Mumbai boy told his mother from his hospital bed last July. The boy died soon after, killed by the rat poison he consumed after the adult, according to details described to Reuters by his parents and police. The article goes on to say, Inspector Balwant Deshmukh, the investigating officer, said police have all but given up hope of finding who raped the boy. We will revive the case if we get new clues, but as of now, it's in cold storage, he told Reuters. Now, you may say, Blue, hang on. If the police are paying attention to the case, then it's obviously not legal to rape boys. Obviously, the police don't just ignore it. And that's true, but it's still not quite equal, and it's still not quite so black and white. And I'm going to dig into that in just a little bit. And I will say a big reason why this is changing, because the situation has changed since that first article in 2013, but because of men's rights activists, because of what MRAs do. And this is why when feminists say, how come MRAs say, well, what about the men or what about the boys? It's because we're trying to change situations such as this. And we are slowly but surely succeeding in doing that. But anyway, here's the article goes on. It's not highlighted because it's the entire page. So let's start. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government last month introduced a death penalty for the rape of girls below 12 and increased the minimum punishment for those who are victims under 16, after the rapes of an 8-year-old girl and young woman in 2 states ruled by his party led to public protest. But the emergency order, known as an ordinance, did not mention boys, although a government survey has showed that male minors were more likely to be victims than female minors. Now, that's an interesting sentence. Although a government survey has showed that male minors were more likely to be victims than female minors. The ordinance lapses in 6 months, and the government has to introduce legislation to convert it into law. At the time, the government plans to broaden the statute to make it gender neutral, said a senior government official who declined to be named. Whatever happens to girls will apply to boys, the official said. Now, you might say, oh, but isn't that proof of progress, that things are starting to be equal? Yes, it shows that we're starting to make progress there. This article is from 2018, but it's because MRAs had to constantly raise the point, what about the men, what about the boys, and had to campaign against feminists in India. And again, check that link. If you don't believe me, that is exactly what happened in 2013 as to why this had to happen in the first place. And even still, take a look. Insia Dawala, who runs a foundation that raises awareness about child sexual abuse, says police genuinely lack the sensitivity to deal with cases of assaults on boys. I have interacted with adult male survivors and social workers who have cited police hostility, ridicule, and even lack of trust when it comes to believing a boy was sexually abused, she said. The most common perception dished out to male survivors is that they may have enjoyed it. And here's again where, and I don't think that this is how most feminists in the West think. I think most feminists in the West would agree with me that men and boys should be protected under rape laws. But what the situation was in India and what the law was in India for a very long time and is now finally changing is very different than what the Western media might show. Yes, a lot of stories about dowry killings and women being raped are 100% true. But India is a very large country with a lot of diversity in the different regions you go. It's 1.3 billion people. And there's a very different side to the one-sided story you sometimes get in the West. And this is something that LRAs have been trying to highlight for a long time in India. And it's not to say that female issues aren't important. It's not to say that female issues don't exist. It's not to say that there aren't large swaths of Indian society that are patriarchal. It's to say there are other victims too. And if you really care about this, then you should care about all of them, not just some of them. And that said, at the time of this article, 2018, the law was not equal. In the meantime, the minimum punishment for raping a boy is 10 years in jail, compared with 20 years for assaults on girls under 16. It's very telling, though, that to an MRA, that's almost considered a win. Because, well, at least it's something, right? At least it's that 10 years. At least it's something. The fact that male victims are recognized at all is something that MRAs consider a victory in many cases. Just imagine if the genders were reversed for any crime or for any situation where simply your gender meant you got more punishment if you happen to be female. The article goes on, why this discrimination? Asked the father of the boy who was raped, sitting in his tiny first-floor home in a teeming settlement near Mumbai's international airport, largely populated by migrant worker families from India's poor northern states. Look, the bottom line is it is complicated, especially in a country like India, when you look at laws on sexual assault. But in general, I don't think it's unfair to ask, what about the men? What about the boys? Because in essence, isn't that kind of what feminism is doing? Saying, well, what about women in the workplace? What about women's right to vote? What about girls in education? What about women in the work? There's nothing wrong with asking that question. It's a perfectly valid question. If you're talking about equality and two sides, there's nothing wrong with looking at the situation, looking at the law, looking at the data and saying, well, hey, what about this? What about this? Why is that not a fair question to ask? And that's been weaponized, and that's been turned into this sort of weird comeback saying, oh, you're just doing what about the men? But why not? What's wrong with that question? People say all that's doing is taking away from women's issues, but how?